Hi, everyone. Welcome to Journey 25. And today I have Ian Brooks on the program. And I'm excited to talk to Ian. He has some really cool experiences and actually just wrote a book that he's going to talk a little bit about. But I guess, Ian, to start off here, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself? A little bit about your past, kind of what got you to where you are now, where you grew up, maybe a little bit about your childhood, and then, what you've been doing professionally for the last little bit.
Sure. So, hello everyone, and pleasure to meet with you today, Jared, and talk about the journey that we all have. I've been in the field of like change management for about 25 years, working with people in the psychology field, both as a clinical therapist while also being in organizations. And also, my passion for being and working with people started off when I was a kid. I can recall a time in high school where I thought to myself, I wonder why people do what they do. And I was always curious to really see what drove people toward certain decisions. And that reality for me came when my parents were having an argument, and I was just got emotional about it, and I started crying. So two things resonated. One, I made the decision that day not to cry ever again in my life because I got tired of crying. And then secondly, why do people do what they do? And that curiosity has been a trajectory for me in some of the decisions I've made, both from a career standpoint and just general interest. I grew up in Virginia, right outside DC, and my journey has taken me from DC to here in the States to Alabama and Georgia, and now here on the West Coast, all afforded me an opportunity to work in different industries. As I mentioned, from a clinical psychology background, so I worked with children and adults. When I was working with the adults, I was working in a 24-hour lockdown ward. And you want to talk about a real life and sobering experience.
Oh, yeah.
Let me tell you, very interesting experience, and has established my foundation from a knowledge base on how people interact and how they make decisions and what does influence them. And I think it was one day when I was actually washing a grown man because he couldn't wash himself. I thought, I need to make better decisions, actually in the ward. And then I made the switch over to working with corporations and people from a coaching standpoint, one on one. And using the skills that I learned as a therapist, just from the act of listening, having the conversation, and most importantly, caring, has really provided a great transition to me as I work with my clients today, both from organizational change perspective, as well as through context of one-on-one coaching in that narrative as well. One, caring for people and how they really want to improve their own particular story. That has led me to actually, as you described, to writing my book, Intention. And this is my very first book. It'll be released on April 27th. And it's really intended to bridge that gap of that self-help of what can we do individually to actually move forward, and closing some of our gaps of some of the traditional self-help books of, hey, let's just jump to the result or talk in certain generalities. I really put the focus back on you, put the focus up front on building a foundation, which I think is one of the biggest challenges that we have in change. So I'm glad to meet with you today. And that's a little bit about me and my background.
Really cool. And, I'm just curious, Ian, just kind of, clicking into a little bit on making that switch from, more the therapy world to the coaching world and, going from a high intense, high stress, environment to, well, a different type of high stress environment and, a little bit more of that corporate, high achiever world. What do you think was the catalyst for making that switch?
Sure. So I think there's two, a catalyst and then what some of the variations are, and even potentially some of the similarities. The catalyst for me, aside from my joking aside of washing a grown man, was how do I actually deal with that emotion inside? Like when I was being a therapist, I was holding on to the emotions of which I was hearing and from the stories of the individuals of whom I was working with, be it individually or in group therapy. And I didn't know how to let that go. I took it home with me. So at the end of the day, I was just exhausted, just emotionally and mentally exhausted. And, obviously to take myself off the hook for a moment, if I may, then at that moment, I wasn't ready and I didn't know how to let things go. So I held on to it. But I knew that the skills I was learning could easily transfer over to the different skill sets of people every single day, because we all have our own challenges, as well as we all have our own goals and expectations. So even moving, as you mentioned, to the corporate side, where you have high achievers, or you have people who are driven to actually make change happen. Um, that in and of itself was a challenge because we think we know better. When we're having conversations, when you're dealing with especially high achievers and those who have titles within organizations, they got there for a reason. And then that isn't and should not be diminished in any respect. But we all have challenges. We all have opportunities to grow and learn. And thus having a conversation of what someone else believes they know to be true versus in a clinical therapy setting in a lockdown ward where you're being told you have to be here, that's a little bit different. So the conversation's a little bit different. It's a lot more engagement. It's a lot more, let me meet you where you are. Let me see what you are now willing to do by choice. And now let's now move forward on a particular path that's going to make you more successful or refine the edges on how you're actually interacting in the business.
Yeah, that's interesting too, and it kind of makes sense where, in your first in the lockdown ward, it was, I imagine, all, if not the vast majority, were there almost against their will, right? Or they have to be there,
Mhm.
right? And then
Mhm.
you move on to the, again, the more corporate world, and it's, these people want to improve, and
Mhm.
it resonated a ton as well when you're talking about taking those emotions home, right?
Yeah.
Because like for me, I've always been a huge empath, and I take on other people's emotions, and especially when
Right.
I joke that it's my superpower, right? It's being able to
Mhm.
see where other people are coming from and be able to empathize with them. However, that takes a big toll on me a lot of times because I need to embody those emotions.
Mhm.
And I'm what came to mind too is this idea of almost being selfish to be selfless, right?
Yeah.
And do you think there was a part where it was getting to be just too much for you, whereas I feel like I can no longer do the job as well as I know I can, because it's just I'm taking this home too much, and I'm really going to be doing a disservice to the patients, and so therefore I'm going to go into a different environment, one that's more fulfilling to me, or one that isn't, or I don't need to take these things home so that I can help people better. Did that factor into it at all? I'm curious.
Well, the what really factored into it, it was less about being selfless and being afraid of my impact to those individuals in the ward. Because again, they had a lot of challenges, again, from a chemical imbalance standpoint, and then putting them right back into their environment. The biggest challenge I had was what was the disservice I was doing to myself?
Yeah.
Because I wasn't able to let it go. I kind of liken it to the Green Mile, the movie Green Mile, and with Michael Clark Duncan's characters taking on the pain of, in this particular instance, Tom Hanks and pulling out all the pain that he had. And when you pull that in and you're holding on to it, like in the movie, Michael Clark Duncan's character could actually regurgitate that out. Well, I had no way of doing that. I didn't have the means, both mentally or just the process, to do that. And I really didn't think about it in that regard. But I knew it was doing a disservice for me because it was eating me up in a number of different respects. Now I fast forward to working with my clients in the corporate space, and even one-on-one on a personal level. I do take their ideas home with me, but not in the same way. I know that we are making choices, and we're talking about that upfront. We're talking about who they are upfront, and now just acknowledging that, and based off of who they are and their choices, that energy coming back to me of, hey, you didn't do what you were supposed to do, or we find ourselves right back where we originally were. Now we have an anchoring point to say, okay, you made this choice. Here's what we said. Here was the likely outcome. So I'm less inclined to, not to say I don't care as much as we planned for this and we knew that was probably going to happen. So that weight is a little bit different in that respect as well. And I also have to go, mention as well that sometimes when I'm working with clients, they don't come on their own fruition. I'm assigned to them. So sometimes it's, well, why are you here? So that's also the other part too. It's like, well, I need a coach. Okay, well, let's talk about this and my role and what I'm here to help you do.
And it's interesting too that you say that, because one of the biggest realizations I've had when, I kind of started on my journey of, self improvement and self discovery was that the person themselves needs to be willing to do the work. Otherwise, you can't force somebody to do it. Right. And
Absolutely.
you can make minor improvements, you can make minor tweaks, but if that person is not ready to fully commit themselves to doing it, you're not going to get very far. And I think a lot of people, either trick themselves into thinking of like, oh, I'm actually ready, but I don't want to do the hard stuff, right? I'm going to start, I'm going to start easy, or, taking these tiny little steps that they, build up in their minds to be these huge, life-changing moments. Have you experienced that at all? I'm curious of, people that aren't, when they aren't willing to do the work, either because they're forced to be there, or they just mentally, they think that they are, but they're not truly ready. Have you run into that? And what are your experiences with it?
Yeah, I definitely run into it in quite a bit. Actually, in my book, Intention, one of the reasons I start with discovery is about understanding what are we truly solving for? Because that re-anchors people back to what do you think you are solving? Because quite frankly, what you think we're solving for isn't really what we need to be solving for. It's what you perceive, be it what you perceive individually or what someone else has projected onto you as a solve. To your very statement and question, people often hide from that, saying, okay, let me just get to the end result, especially in the corporate world where everything is based off of return on investment,
Yeah.
right? Return on my energy. Like, hey, let's go. I just need to solve this, check the box, and let's move on with my life. So it's even more important to really establish that foundation up front. And because of that, I spend a lot of time talking to them up front about, okay, here's what you perceive as happening. Now, here's some of your choices in this. Let's talk about what you're willing to do. Let's talk. I mean, let's just be honest. We're not trying to hide anything. This is not an indictment against you. It does mean that let's acknowledge who you are. Let's acknowledge those choices. And now let's move forward. And sometimes it's a struggle because, again, people hide from this. I recall having a client, um, she felt overwhelmed, and that's what her biggest issue was. And she was a small business owner, just getting it kicked off the ground. And in that example, feeling overwhelmed, obviously, what would one do? Start to be able to delegate to your board of directors, start delegating to individuals who report to you. Yet, when we came to the idea of delegation, did she want to delegate? No. It's like, oh, I have to do this. I have to do this. I have to do this. They're looking for me to do this. Well, it can't be all you and have this context of being overwhelmed. Oh, yeah, by the way, you wanted to run a separate side business that was outside of this that would pay for this new startup company, along with two other things you wanted to do. So now let's figure out what your choice is. But yet you thought you were overwhelmed. Well, you are. But based on your choice of now not being able to delegate, although you said you wanted to, although said you were willing to, you didn't. You are right back where you are. And so it's an ongoing dialogue. So it's being able to show and demonstrate a mirror to people, to one saying, hey, here's what we are deciding in a moment of truth, of calmness, of that point of before the storm hits, let's now think through what is actually can we do, and let's plan for that so that when the storm hits, we're better prepared, or at least we acknowledge what we're supposed to be doing. And now it comes down to choice and then action. And in this particular individual's case, she often struggled with that in across that journey, but it's something that was overt in that respect.
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting because that's just randomly another topic I've thought a lot about is, people being put in leadership positions. And, it's always interesting to me when I watch somebody be put into a leadership position, either for the first time or when they don't have a lot of experience with it, or they've just been stuck in, their ways for a long time. And I'm curious if you think that it comes down to insecurity. Because when I hear that story of, I'm feeling overwhelmed, but I won't delegate anything to anybody else. For me, that kind of shoots up the red flag of like, oh, is that coming from a place of insecurity that, you feel like you need to get all of the accolades for it, right? Or that you feel like nobody else can do it as good as you can, or that you won't be able to handle it if they screw up or whatever it might be. And I'm curious, do you think that that's where it comes from, or have you found another root cause that you've seen?
Yeah, I think it's to what you described. There is a part of it that is insecurity, and it could be that no one else can do it as well as I can. Which leads to the second part is how have I been rewarded in the past? How has success been defined for me? In that respect, is sometimes it's I have to do the work. And how well have I been able to demonstrate and what have I been rewarded based on, be it in the context of a business ownership perspective or within a corporate, more structured, boxed perspective. And so when you combine the fear with Now your reward, now you've got something that you're working with as you just described, and now you can establish the patterns. Now you can understand the templates of someone and how they're operating. And for this particular individual, that's what I established with her. I understood immediately amongst one of our first two meetings. I said, it doesn't seem like you have an overwhelm problem. It seems like, now what are you willing to give up? And who can you trust? Right. And if you don't have the right people, now let's think about the hiring. Now let's think about what you feel comfortable giving up. And now let's figure out, what are you defining as successful? Knowing that success is the business and taking it out of the context of success as an individual.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the challenges that I've seen as a consistent theme around that fear, and how we define truly our success and how we've been rewarded in the past really influence some of our behaviors, especially in leaders.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's a big word, fear, right? And I think that
Yeah.
it plays into a lot of different parts of our lives, and a lot of different ways that it shows up. And I'm kind of curious too of these, again, seemingly completely different environments, right? From a 24-hour lockdown ward to going more corporate America.
Mhm.
I'm curious, is there some similar themes that you saw come up, with people struggling with, of when you really get down to the root of it? Like, yes, the details are going to be different, but when you get down to the root of it, is it fear? Is it insecurity? Is it, things coming from their childhood? And how much crossover was there?
Yeah.
I'm curious because I'm curious to see if there was the same root causes, but they show up in different ways in different people. Of sometimes they'll go down one path, sometimes they'll go down the other path.
Yes. And you know what? There's a lot of similarities, but their starting point's a lot different, and what they're trying to solve for is a lot different. On that ward piece, it's because of chemical imbalance. They're having taking medicine, and you have to get them recycled onto new medicine and then go through individual therapy
Yeah,
as well as group therapy. Versus, obviously in the corporate space, while some may need therapy and otherwise, aren't there for that purpose.
yeah,
But there is quite a bit of similarity in that respect. The first being, when I start off from a discovery standpoint, what are we solving for, and really being able to understand, okay, what's this person's challenge? What is that we are really driving towards? And I talk about this as a guide in my book, actually. Really understanding, what are we solving for? Now, from a clinical standpoint, it's now, okay, we need to make sure they're on their medicines, making sure that we are now keeping track of them on a more consistent basis. From a corporate standpoint, it's a function of, what is their perceived outcomes or challenges that they have, or how we springboarding them into a new role that we are now developing them for. Because in the corporate space, and even one-on-one, it could be positive. It doesn't always have to be negative. But the other part behind that, very similar, especially from the upfront piece, is establishing a foundation, and in particular, the environment of our people, places, and things. One of the biggest challenges that I had when I was in the clinical space, was that we're in a 24-hour lockdown ward. Can't stress that enough. Because I mean, just imagine being in that space. But what that implies are several things. One, I've got a captive audience. You're not going anywhere. You are actually staying here for 14 days and likely even longer. In that context, you're on a regimen. You're scheduled. You're taking your medicine in the morning. You're going to eat breakfast. You're going to do group therapy. You might have one-on-one therapy. You might see the doctor. You'll get outside, do some exercise. You come back in. It is extremely regimented, absolutely to the T. But guess what happens after you take them outside of that regimented environment, to get them recycled, to get them feeling comfortable? You're putting them back in an environment that may or may not support that same level of regimen. One, because they're now rechanging back into, I've got to now take these pills every single day. I'm feeling fine. I'm feeling great. And then they get overconfident. Secondly, now from that regiment standpoint, they're with their family and friends, of whom don't have, to be in the lockdown ward, or don't have to take medicine. So now there's a stigma associated with that. So often what would happen is, while we tried to meet with the parents, or trying to meet with the families to actually get them more acclimated and changing the structure of their environment, often they'd be right back 3-4 months later, for the same reasons, cycling off their own medicine. Oh, I'm fine. My environment isn't necessarily supportive of that. That's also similar to what happens in the corporate space as well for leaders, because we get comfortable. Again, going back to, they're successful, or they've been promoted, or we just need to change a few things here to refine our skills. So they already know they're doing well. I just need to change this one thing. For
Mm.
them, it's their environment of how have they surrounded themselves, be it in their people, places, and things that support who they've become today. Because why change? Making great money, got a lot of opportunities. I've got great staff. But the idea around that is now different in the corporate space. It's like, okay, we need to start changing a few things. So when you go to a meeting, what does that routine look like? When you're actually having a conversation, how are you building trust and showing authenticity? How are you creating a certain level of engagement? And now, how do you need to show up? Those are different behaviors. Now, how we're going to try to reinforce that now in an environment that now you have choice around. So there's a little bit more leeway in that respect, and how to integrate that now with that choice and how to actually apply it. But the principles are still the same. And I delve into that into the book as well, recognizing the similarities that is a common thread between both audiences, but just applied in a different way.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. And, my mind went back to that word fear again, right? Because I
Yeah.
think a lot of times, especially being in leadership positions, within a company, a lot of times your people will lead based off of fear, right?
Yes.
Instead of actually trying to foster real engagement, real feedback, it is, fostering that fear of what I say goes. And, sometimes you're expendable, so you better work hard. And, I've just seen and, thought about how unsustainable it is, right? And
Yes.
even though it is the overarching culture in a lot of places, that's why people leave. That's why there's turnover. That's why, there'll always be a cap on the upside. And, I'm curious, have you run into that with your people if they're doing it consciously or subconsciously, the, clients that you're coaching?
Yeah, I think it's both consciously and subconsciously, where that fear is coming out. And that fear comes out by how they respond to certain topics or how they respond in an email or conversation or even their behaviors and how they create engagement. A lot of it can be tracked back down to fear. It's like, what are you afraid of? What do we now need to remove so that we take it out of fear and take it one of empowerment? Be it with your direct reports, it could be your peers, or it even could be even their interaction with those above them, because that's extremely got to acknowledge that fear of just having conversations. Well, I'm in an example. I'm someone might be used to not saying a word when their boss is in a meeting. Well, what fear is that driven from? Is it personal? Is it a reaction that you received in one particular meeting? Is this the culture of the environment that you're in? Now we have to delve into that a little bit and to figure out if this is something that is part of our priority to change. Then now let's look for opportunities to exercise that level of ability. But with fear comes risk and vulnerability. That with any change, I don't personal, corporate, or even in the world, there is a certain level of vulnerability that does come with that. I recall being a manager, for a team of about 15 people, and one of the biggest things that I always reinforced with them was, I want you to fail. And the reason is that I want that failure to offer us a place of reference, not of resident. So that can get you to grow. Now, I'm going to put you in situations where that growth is going to be continuous because, quite frankly, in this particular instance, they were trainers and they were very good at their job, but yet getting stale, and they need to be pushed in different areas to learn new curriculum, do different topics, present in different ways. I also recognize that their performance impacted mine. So that's another part of the fear, right? As we think about certain leaders, that now my team's a reflection of me. But I looked at that fear and said, no, that's something that's good. I want them to fail because, one, that's even going to provide even more motivation for me to actually coach and really be present with my team on, one, being very specific on what I want them to try. Secondly, we're going to look fear in the face and look failure and say, you know what, that's our baseline. And now we're going to improve. That does take some level of vulnerability. That also takes some level of confidence, knowing that I got this. And I'm not worried about a specific outcome as much as I'm building towards capabilities. It's also a reason why the tagline of my book is helping you build your capabilities,
Yeah.
right? And the word capabilities is extremely important. It's not an outcome, it's how am I helping you along your journey? And the reality is sometimes leaders get caught up in how am I being perceived, or that failure is my anchor point, when in reality, it's only your anchor point if you let it be. Now, how do we move forward and say, you know what, here's why I course corrected to make progress?
No, it's really interesting that you bring up vulnerability, and it was really the overarching theme last year for me. Vulnerability
Okay.
was a huge piece because I realized that I've never truly been vulnerable with anybody in my entire life, and so slowly opening up and slowly, sharing more and more and more, it led to so much growth on my end. And honestly, looking at it has also made me way more capable. And
Sure.
you know, I'm curious on your thoughts on how does one foster either vulnerability in their team or within their self? And do you think that safety plays a key ingredient in it? And what I mean by that is it a requirement to have a safe environment in order to be vulnerable? Is that the key ingredient, or is it something else that you've seen?
Well, I think the safety is relative to who you ask and when you ask them, and that level of vulnerability of which we're really willing to put ourselves through. It actually even starts more so towards what am I willing to do, because a choice of a single person is different than a choice of someone who's married with kids, looking at the same problem and what they're willing to risk in that, and how much vulnerability are they really going to put themselves in. And so I just want to at least acknowledge that differentiator, because not all risks and vulnerabilities are treated the same. But that being said, I would say that there is a certain level of support that comes along with that. One of the pieces that I'm a huge proponent of is having a support team, maybe that's there to help champion or create a situation where it's going to force you to do something a little bit different. And that takes confidence in yourself. If you don't have a belief that you can get something done, I can almost guarantee you that you won't achieve it. When I was doing my dissertation, my topic was around confidence of an individual to get achieve a particular outcome, as well as the confidence they had in their leaders and actually coaching them to specific goals. And what we found was that people were willing to put forth the effort and execute if they had one, the right support, they had the right feedback, and they had their own personal motivation to move forward. Now, obviously, as we think about it from a scoring standpoint, we typically rate ourselves higher on goals and expectations because, hey, I put forth 200 hours worth of work. I don't care if I just moved an inch, but I put in 200 hours worth of work. So I'm getting credit for all those 200 hours. But others might see that a little bit differently. But we have to be vulnerable to be able to put ourselves out in a place that really expands us. And I think this last year, as you described from your own journey, for me, likewise, has been truly that transformative opportunity to build a capability to be vulnerable in a lot different ways, both with my book, both with hopping on podcasts, and just sharing my thoughts in ways of which that I hadn't previously. I would like to put a pin in this for a moment, but and now pivot to you because I know that one of the things that you've shared on previous podcasts and have identified is around your own journey, and that quarter life crisis, if you will. I'm curious in your experience, as you think about the vulnerability that it took around that transition, what your experience might have been.
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting. I just want to touch on the vulnerability piece for myself really quickly. Is that for me? I think the unlock was doing it in a safe environment. And I love that you brought that up of
Mhm.
what does safe mean, and it's different for every single person that you ask, and at every single different time that you ask them.
Yeah.
And for me, it was finding a very close group of individuals. It was joining a men's group
Okay.
where I really started to open up about the deepest, darkest depths of myself that I held so much shame around. And I thought if anybody knew them, like they would never talk to me again, they would never look at me again. I would be a terrible person, whatever it might be. And slowly but surely, every week I'd kind of crack open a little bit more, crack open a little bit more, and then I got more comfortable with vulnerability. And once I was able to do it in that environment, and realize that there is that safety around it of I can tell people this and the world doesn't end,
Yeah.
and like it doesn't make me a terrible person and all those different things. I was able to do it more and more, which goes into starting the podcast. And for me, that idea of being selfish to be selfless was I started it for very selfish reasons. of,
Mm.
okay, like, I realized that the thing that I was afraid of the most and the thing that I wanted the most in life was to be in the, proverbial spotlight. And that's not, necessarily to say being famous or anything like that.
Mhm.
It's more to be seen, is to be seen for
Sure.
who I am and have that attention on me.
Mhm.
And the other big piece is like, okay, now I'm comfortable being vulnerable in front of people that I know and I trust and I'm close to. Well, now for me, because I'm a very extreme person, I'm like, okay, well, I need to go do it for everybody. And so I'm going to put this out to the world, and I'm going to talk about the things that I hold shame around. I'm going to talk about the things that I don't like talking about. I'm going to be as vulnerable as humanly possible in all of my conversations to force myself to get over it, because I
Right.
could also tell that that was holding me back. Of a lot of the
Right.
things that I held on to were holding me back, and I couldn't move on, and I couldn't achieve the things that I wanted to if I was letting those weigh me down. And that played
Right.
into the quarter life crisis. And it
Okay.
started with, a couple of years of therapy, then moved into the men's group, just doing a lot of kind of self discovery. And, it stemmed from a place of unhappiness. And I just
Mm.
realized that something was wrong and I needed help. And
Sure.
for me, I was always the person that would look for the next achievement, right?
Mhm.
And so once I achieve this, then I'll be happy. And then you'd get
Right.
there and I'd be like, well, I don't feel any different. you know,
Right.
like, what is this? Okay, I got to go to the next one. I'm like, okay, I'll
Right.
double that goal. And then once I hit that, then I'll be happy. And then same thing, I'd get there and it'd be like, well, I don't feel any different. And so,
Right.
the story I tell myself is just that, I just need to do more. I didn't set my sights high enough. And
Mm.
I realized that it was actually an internal problem of,
Mhm.
I held a very bad view of myself. I had very low self-worth. I was able to fake confidence a lot of times, but there was not an ounce of it in there.
Mm.
And realizing that I just couldn't fake it anymore, and
Right.
I needed to approach it from a different way. And that's kind of where I started to find my own voice, and
Okay.
I stopped seeking approval, because that was the other thing that guided my entire life was, wanting to be seen, wanting that approval from people, wanting to get my worth from them, them to tell me that I'm worthy, that I'm doing a good job, that I've
Mhm.
achieved something. And I just got to the point where I was like, well, this isn't what I want anymore.
Right.
And as I started to, look at my life and think about what I wanted and where I was, and I realized I had to make a big change. And so, I always joke that I blew up my life, but it was, kind of true. Blew up my life, started over from scratch.
Okay.
Still recovering.
Yeah.
Um, but even though, it's funny looking at it externally, people looking in at me, it's probably the lowest, call it status that I've had in
Mhm.
my entire life. However, it is internally the happiest I've ever been and the best I've ever
That's
felt.
great.
And
That's
so, yeah, that's a little bit behind the quarter life crisis and what's kicked that off, and why some of these topics are so important to me, because I've literally had people that I hadn't seen in about a year and a half, and I recently connected with them again, and
Mhm.
literally them be like, "You're completely different. Like, you're a new person. Like, I've seen so much change in you," and realizing just the change inside myself, and hoping that other people can find that too. So that's where a lot of the stuff that I do comes from.
Yeah, and I mean that's a great story. I think it's what a lot of us go through, especially again as we transform our stories and finding our voice. And as you described, even yours being in the not necessarily spotlight, but having your voice heard and going through that transformation, saying, okay, now I just need to bomb everything that I'm doing. Um, to me, that's that really speaks volumes of one, recognizing where you want to be, but secondly, changing your environment. Like, look, I got to change everything. And sometimes it's just giving up a lot. And it goes back to that vulnerable place because you didn't just bomb something. Now you have to deal with the ramifications from it.
Yeah.
And having confidence say, you know what, this is worth the risk. This is worth my time. And I think it's when you put it into that context, as your story articulates, I think, and even when I talk about with the readers as well, this is about you. At the end of the day, this is your story. And what are you willing to do? And it's okay to bomb and just do something different and change everything that's around you. But you're also gonna have the confidence to get out of there too. And that's okay. You're gonna get there. And sometimes you do have to take those changes because I know I've done the same
Yeah,
in a lot of respects. In maybe certain and somewhat similar, but in different characters per se. But it's I can definitely understand blowing up stuff um,
yeah,
and and saying, hey, I need to, in order for me to be the person I want to be, and as others see me as being, I need to change everything.
for
So
sure.
let's go.
And
Let's
you
go.
know, I think that that's one thing I really resonated a ton with, of through this conversation, our previous one as well, is this idea of looking at the individual, right?
Mhm.
Because everybody is so different, and everybody has their own, people call it baggage, but their own experiences, and what they've lived
Mhm.
through, their own goals, their own, circumstances, environments. Everything is so different, and looking at each person, right, and having them acknowledge that as well. And um, I've it's why a lot of times I have a problem with blanket advice,
Yeah.
right? And I think I see myself as an outlier as well. And so I'm like, okay, even if this advice works for most of the bell curve,
Mhm.
it doesn't work for everybody. And
Right.
taking that with a grain of salt, and not just following it of, oh, this is advice from a source that I trust, or somebody that I look up to, or this is what they did, and so I'm going to do the same exact thing.
Mhm.
Which I don't believe in. I believe in distilling those lessons of
Mhm.
what is the idea behind this, what is the lesson that is trying to get across, and then
Right.
shifting the details to fit your life. And so I'm curious, how much you think of it the same way, and kind of where that idea came from of looking at each person and asking them to look at themselves.
Yeah, I'm 200% behind you, as you mentioned, in the book. That's why I spend so much time on you. I in that section, in the principle of you as individuals and individuals, plural, because we all have characters. We all have the people of whom we've become and are, and that guide our life. And having one idea that is transparent across everyone just doesn't fit. It's also the reason in my book, I actually give a number of different examples, both fiction and nonfiction, to offer a different perspective because two people can read the same thing and come away with something different because of their own template of what they have in their mind. But I'm asking people as we're having conversations or for themselves as they're reading the book, asking themselves questions that now reframe the experience to a new model. And as such, that really stemmed from my experience early on in working with kids through therapy, as well as I started working with adults, knowing that some of the challenges are exactly the same, but and we're using a similar principle and the art of question. Yet when you ask someone that question, how their experience individually, how they're going to take it's going to change. You can put the same two people in the same household with relatively the same experience, they'll come up with different answers based off of their own perceptions, on their own environment, on their own people, places, and things that keep them safe, that keep them knowledgeable around the ideas around the world. Because again, one of the other points I want to hone in on, and part of that is around our own personal biases that we come in because we come up with these biases to so we don't have to think, right? We just want to just react so we can make quick judgments. That's a friendly face. I can go there. Ooh, the stove is hot. I don't want to touch it. Based off experience, but also bias. Ooh, if I see someone who's looking like this, I may need to stay away. Again, it could be that narrative that influences us all, but we can look at the same thing and have a very unique perspective. As we think about changing and our story, it's a very personal journey, and it's one that can't be glossed over. Although the media and both from social and otherwise try to define us and put us into a place that makes us all the same, yet we are very unique. So we're rewarding the uniqueness, but guess what happens? Everybody and their mother were going to go out there and try to do the same thing because that was cool, it was fun, it was wonderful. It's like, okay, I'm trying to be unique. I don't follow me. Go and do your own thing, right? Um, and also not comparing ourselves to other people as well. And so it really, from that working with the children and the adults, and now seeing just transformations, even in myself, acknowledging that journey is a very personal one, and we don't need to apologize for it. It's an acknowledgement of who we are, but also that empowers us to make the choices that are right for us, that may or may not be right for someone else, but I can still get to the same goal, whatever that goal is.
Love that. And, it just, when you're talking about biases, it reminds me of, something I say a lot of, a big piece of my work was looking back and challenging my beliefs around things of,
Hmm.
is this true, or is this, something that I decided was,
Yeah.
or something that somebody introduced to me?
Mhm.
Is this true, or was this a decision I made when I was a child that I've held on for so long that I just assumed that is true, but when I challenge it, I realize it's not. So I love that. And, I want to go into this quickly too, of just talking about goal setting, because I think that you have, an interesting view on it, because, I've always had
Mhm.
problems with goal setting. I hate them. I hate setting
Yeah.
goals. I hate the SMART goal framework, the writing it out. It's not my personality. And, as I dug into it, I kind of was able to pick out my problems with it, right?
Mhm.
And the first one being the difficulty of the goals.
Mhm.
Either them being way too easy, or essentially you're setting this goal that you're going to hit no matter what, just for the confidence boost, right?
Right. Just so I can feel
So I
good.
can feel good, and like that's great. And at the same time, it doesn't, achieve really what goals are supposed to, and pushing you and having you, do more. The other one is when they're super rigid, right? Of it's
Right.
almost impossible to hit the goal, not because of the difficulty, but because how rigid it is. There's no wiggle room. There's no chance for error. There's, if outside forces come into play, you automatically fail your goal, right? And
Right.
that's one of the biggest ones. The second one is just the psychology behind being okay with not hitting a goal,
Mhm.
and challenging it of, really, in my opinion, the goals that you should be setting are ones that you're probably not going to hit, right?
Yep.
Because you want to challenge yourself to push to get it, and realizing that you should celebrate the progress that you've made, not a pass fail, right?
Right. Yeah.
And then the last one is a lot of times people setting goals that are dependent on other people's actions, right?
Yes.
Instead of habits that they can form themselves. And
Yeah.
like for me, I was thinking, I related it back to business terms because that's easiest for me to wrap my head around. But a friend of mine was talking about essentially marketing, his business, and he's like, I don't remember the numbers, right, but I'm gonna get 50 leads per month or per week or whatever it was.
Mhm.
And, for me, I'm like, I think that you should frame it more of, I'm going to spend 10 hours a week on marketing, or whatever
Okay.
it might be. It, the things that you can control, and let the results, fall where they
Yeah.
may, because you could do a terrible job and still get results just by luck. And you could do an amazing
Absolutely.
job and not get much results. But, I do believe in the averages. And, if you
Yeah.
extrapolate it out long enough, then, the pieces are going to fall where they should. And so I'm just curious your thoughts
Right.
on that, and your thoughts on goal setting in general.
Yeah, I think you're spot on a number of topics. As we think about start with the end and kind of go from to the beginning there, I think when we have our goals and we say let's get to 50 goal, 50 leads, you're absolutely right. It's now you've hit an endpoint. When it's is it really 50 or it's about our behaviors? And it's really about how do you again, I'm going to reinforce this word, building a capability. What's our true habits that we are now integrating into our life versus hey, I just achieved everything that I wanted and got the 50. Now I'm done. I'll even give it back to you on a personal level for you, as you described you when you're doing your transformation and looking for yourself, you realized you hit your next goal, and yet you still didn't really achieve your goal, right? Of being happy and that reward. So it now even reframes what actually success really means and how do we make it pervasive in our lives so we can move forward. In that context, I talk a little bit about the Wile E. Coyote effect, from
Okay.
the kid cartoon, The
Yeah.
Roadrunner. And no, there's no two instances where he ever used the same contraption to try to catch the Roadrunner. He never learned. And And what would happen if he did catch the Roadrunner? One, the show would, obviously not exist. But as important, he wasn't solving the broader problem. Now, if he was probably really smart, he'd probably give the Roadrunner more food or find another Roadrunner. That way, they get more Roadrunners, and now he's just picking them off one at a time. And while they're creating their family and spreading out, he's can get more options rather than just that one. But that's here nor there. The reality is as we think about goals, it's oftentimes that we limit ourselves, and we limit ourselves by the end point, and that there is a finish line. But as we're talking about change, it really comes down to, what am I consistently doing, regardless of outcome? That outcome could be success, and now how do I refine it and put it into a different situation? It could be, I failed, now how do I refine? It even gets specifically to some of what you described earlier as well. And that is, sometimes our goals are a little bit too easy just to make ourselves feel good. I interjected in that moment, but it's truly, that's ultimately what happens. Like, hey, I did this. Congratulations. Now I'm going to go back to do whatever I was going to do before.
Yeah.
Or I'm going to set something so hard that people go, whoa, that would be really cool, but you can't attain it. There is no buildup, right? We don't afford ourselves an opportunity to refine. We don't afford ourselves to really think through, I could have done everything right, but it still didn't feel right. Again, going back to the example that you used about yourself, you probably did everything right on all those new experiences, but it still didn't feel right. Now, how does it feel right for me, so that even if I fail or don't succeed, however we define that, it's, I'm doing the right behaviors. Now it's about refining. And it gets to our own neurosis, our own fears, that we have to get to something of conclusion. We have to get to an end point, because I don't want to keep doing this all the time. I get tired. I'm tired of change. I don't want to keep doing this anymore. I'm tired of keep building. Like, okay, I'm done. I'm good. And in full transparency, sometimes that's okay. Sometimes knowing is just okay. But other times, when we're really transforming our story, sometimes it's, no, you're going to have to consistently do this. So it becomes habit. And that's the difference as we think about the use of SMART goals, which in an organizational setting, it's extremely important. And even our personal lives, it's extremely important as well. It's not to diminish that, but it is about that endpoint of being specific, measurable, accountable, results oriented, trackable, and that we are owning. It's not for somebody else to do that as well. And the last point I'll bring up in that respect is, it affords us an opportunity to also set limits. It refines, really, as we're looking at about are talking about progression and building a capability that goes over time. We're also giving ourselves the white lines that we're playing in. We're not trying to do too much. We're not trying to do too little when we're building capabilities, because we know we're building. We're going to come back to it. We're going to refine. We're going to think about it. Oftentimes, we don't give ourselves that 50 leads. Well, hell, where's the wiggle room in that? It's either you did or you didn't. There's a quote that I like, I reference sometimes, and it's by Jean Sartre, and it is, once we hear the details of success, it's hard to distinguish it from defeat. Mm. And as we define ourselves in such rigid ways, it's like, that's the details of success. Once we don't achieve it, well, you didn't succeed, right? And now it's black or white. Really, as we're thinking about behavioral transformation, personal transformation, that we own ourselves, now it's a function of, what are we building towards? It's success defined by those capabilities, and continuous actions and refinement really reshapes that narrative of success, as well as how we're building this for even sustainment.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much. As we wrap up here, I'm curious if there's anything that we didn't get to, or anything that you wanted to say before we wrap up.
No, and this has been a great conversation. I think we've touched on a number of topics that really articulate the challenges that a lot of people have. It starts, in my mind, with a lot of foundational pieces of who we are, what are we solving for. I was recently reading a quote that said, he who does not lay a foundation can course correct on the back end, but at great peril to the architect and trouble or danger to the building. And I thought that was extremely poignant, and it was written in 1533, ironically, that author was really thinking towards building a solid foundation of what we're solving for. And while you might have great abilities to actually solve it later, quite frankly, if you don't do it up front, you're going to put yourself in trouble by trying to go back and course correct and sweep things under the rug, or at danger of whatever you're trying to change because it may all come collapsing down. And so I think about change, and the last, the point that I'll reinforce is with my book and even how I coach. I'm really building towards the end of what can be sustained, what can be done, and it all starts with that foundation, both on what you want and who you are. Everything else starts to become more fluid, and I'm not going to say easier, as much as you know what the white lines you're playing in, so that you can build towards something of a new transformative story.
Love that. Thanks for that. And if people want to follow you or connect with you, where would be the best place for them to do that?
Sure. So I can be reached at rhodessmith.com. So that's RHODESSMITH.com. That's where they can find my book, Intention, as well as where I'll be speaking in other places related to some of my coaching areas. I can also be found on Twitter and Instagram at the handle of Dr. B_intention.
Awesome. And we'll put those in the notes too so that everyone can get to them easy.
Great.
The last question that I like to ask everybody is what does this next phase of your journey look like? And take it however you want, personally, professionally, wherever you want to go with it.
You know what? I think for me, it's combined, much like your journey of what you described previously. It starts with my book Intention. It's really pivoting from a lot of what I've been doing in the past. And when the book launches on the 27th, it's really embarking upon being able to spread the message of how can we transform our stories, and being able to have dialogues, much similar to what we're having now, Jared, but also taking to that another level of how can I individually move forward. And so that means getting out there and speaking more for myself, being more pronounced, as I'm normally not as talkative or out in front, conversely to yourself, or want to be out front in that respect. So for me, that's going to be my continuous journey and creating instances around that so that I can give back to people who are trying to improve, give back in a way when they are ready, that the book Intention, as well as myself, are taking the right steps forward for myself individually, but also the people of whom I'm working with from a coaching standpoint. So those are going to be the biggest steps I see in the near as well as long-term future for myself.
Amazing. Thanks so much for doing this again. Really think that people are going to be able to pull some great stuff out of this. So we'll connect soon, and thank you again. All right.
All right. Sounds great, Jared. Pleasure as always. Thank you.